So I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Devinder, which is a hard job. And I will also overlap a little bit at the beginning, because at Local Futures, we are trying to create awareness along the same lines as Devinder has just explained to us about the economy. So we do that in different ways. One of them is the Economies of Happiness conferences. We've had 21 to date since 2012. And it's a way of generating debate about the economy and its alternatives, and getting a cross-sector of organizations, of people, and even sometimes some more progressive local governments that want to take part in opening up to looking at the economy and what we can do to create general well-being instead of just GDP. And we also run courses, workshops, and other things. And I have also been trying to bring this into secondary schools, thinking that if children can understand about the economic system, all of us can. And we need to find simple ways of getting this across so more people understand what's going on and can take action. So just to remind us that for the most of human history, we've had economies, but we've had real economies, which is sort of the management of nature's household. And we have grown, our cultures have co-evolved with our environments, and so have our economies. So we were living within ecological limits for most of human history. So it's only been in a very short span of time, of course, starting with colonization, but speeding up, as Devinder was saying, to this economic growth model that was thought out in 1947 at Davos. And leading to this growth model, just as Devinder was saying, where you need so-called perpetual growth, and I'm sure it doesn't matter where we come from, we hear it from our politicians all the time, still, the growth myth. Of course, also this go hand in hand, as Devinder was saying, with the need to consume. And we hear all the time when we talk to people, we come back to the same question. People say, but surely it's human greed that is at the basis, that is driving this kind of economy. And we all the time have to remind people, no, we are groomed to consume. We are not born to consume. We're not born wanting one or the other thing. But if you're exposed on an average to 5,000 ads a day, of course it influences you, even when you live in an alternative way. Those of us that do know that our kids are influenced by all this. And let me see. So just a little reminder, global advertising in 2013, $470 billion. How could we have spent this money in a different way? Well, just one thing, if you look at the FAO, $100 billion is what it would take to adapt to climate change. According to UN, $267 billion is what we need to eradicate extreme poverty. And 2 years of the advertising budget, the global advertising budget, we could all shift to renewable energy. So that gives a kind of perspective on the kind of money that is spent on getting us to consume more things that we don't need. Of course, also the financial system, the growth model, the destructive, the cutting down of the trees or the drilling at the Arctic, all this takes money, but there is no limit to money because our financial system, which is private, in the hands of private banks, print money every time someone goes to borrow money. Be it you or me, be it ExxonMobil, or be it the Indian government, no? So all this development is actually driven by an economic system that is based on debt. So it's not like in our household economy where we have to think, I earn so much, so I have to prioritize. Should I spend it on shoes, on clothes, on paying my rent, on whatever? Here, you don't have that. We don't prioritize because the money is not tied to anything real. So only about 3% of the money in circulation is tied to something real, the rest are phantom money. So it's like a casino economy driving destructive development because there's no limit. And of course, the free trade treaties is one of the key mechanisms that allow this global economy to get out of hand, because it's written for the corporations, by the corporations, allowing a kind of deregulation so they can move around at will. For example, you know, moving to Bangladesh, maybe that's the way it was at one point, then moving to China when the salaries were lower there, or to somewhere where there's no environmental regulations and so forth, in order to make more money. I just want to mention briefly NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. I live in Mexico, and that came into force in 1994, and it meant, just like Davinder was saying, it's going to happen now with the no tariff barrier here for 92%. There it meant that US could export to Mexico the basic foods, corn, maize, which is the basic food in Mexico, at a much lower price because they receive huge subsidies, both to fossil fuels, but also agriculture subsidy, export subsidies, undermining local producers in Mexico that had been farming on a small scale level. That meant 50% increase in imported foods, 7 million farmers are estimated to have lost their livelihoods, about 5 million have moved to cities, 2 million of those have migrated abroad, and that's why Trump, not for that reason, but are building a wall. Walmart has spread across the country, the consumption of junk food has gone up. Mexico is now the top consumer of soft drinks and the top of obesity and diabetes. So this is like a summary, but it's a pattern of the free trade. And of course, this has led to an increase in global trade and an increase in emissions that run parallel with that. And what we talk about in Local Futures, which is one of the subjects we try to raise awareness about insane trade, because a lot of the trade that's going on is simply the same things, import and export of identical produce across borders. Very often it's subsidized through export subsidies. Of course, one of the things, this is not included in the carbon budget anywhere because international trade is not accounted to any country. So it's invisible. So, you know, when you sell something from here to another country, or even if it goes 10,000 miles across the ocean on a big tanker that consumes a lot of fossil fuel, that is not accounted anywhere. So people are not looking in the climate debate at the international trade part. Of course, we heard fossil fuel subsidies, 500 billion a year in direct subsidies, 5.3 trillion to fossil fuel industries across the world. And our discussion is still about whether we should recycle plastic or eliminate its single plastic use, right? Not about whether what it would do if we just stopped giving money to the fossil fuel industries. We wouldn't have any plastic. Global infrastructure, 36 trillion in less than 10 years to build that up. That's also subsidy. What if we spent money on local infrastructure of all sorts of things? We already heard this should be 1 billion per minute, Devinda was saying. Of course, industrial agriculture seems more efficient when they get so much subsidies. And, you know, what we have is this development all over the world where industrial agriculture and centralized retailers go hand in hand. And of course, that means that local farmers all over the world do not have anywhere to sell their produce. They might sell it to a centralized retailer, but they'll get very little money and they will be pitted against others and forced to lower their price. And today we have 10 corporations that own most of the industrial foods that are sold everywhere from India, China, Mexico to Denmark. Same things, different names. So what we've had in this global economy, and with the free trade treaties and the subsidies and also the taxes as key mechanisms that has allowed this to happen is a race to the bottom. So in terms of livelihood, salaries, job insecurity, workers' rights, environmental health and protection, as small businesses, local livelihoods have been lost due to the big transnational corporation of this economy that can move around to wherever it suits them, wherever the conditions are the best. So we've got nations, we've got states, we've got towns, you know, struggling and saying, come over here, you know, open up. In Denmark, they want to set up Amazon. Amazon only pays less than 1% in income tax. I am a low income, have a low income. I pay 37%. You know, what is that going to do to local business? It's going to close them down because they have a huge advantage. So we got planetary crisis, we have economic inequality. And the reasons why I've got those touches is that when I started a few years ago talking about this with different students, it was 85 people had the same as the poorest half. Then it was 60-26, and now I think it's 8. There's no denying that we've had an increase everywhere in middle-class consumers that can buy more things. But has it meant that we are happier? I don't know about India. I know about the UK and the US. And apparently, at least there, people are not happier. Happiness peaked in 1950 when people had a more community life. Even within cities, they had fewer things, but they had more meaningful life and they had support from their neighbors. They had daily interaction with other people. Now what we have, both US and UK I mentioned because I know both of them well, is that we have widespread loneliness, and social isolation is now the most serious health threat apparently in the UK, more so than many other modern diseases like high blood pressure and problems with the heart. And we have depression and anxiety amongst the young. In those same 2 countries, we have an enormous increase, and a lot of young people are being treated as if they are mad and medicated, instead of us looking at what is it that is making all of us mentally ill. It's an inhuman system. So what we are saying at Local Futures is that we can't continue along these lines, and we need to shift in the opposite direction, towards local place-based economies working within ecological limits. And we think that localization, we call it localization, other people might call it other things, but it's a shift in the other direction. We think it's kind of a solution multiplier that can deal with many of the problems that we are facing at the same time, the ones that we have been firefighting. Like Sita was mentioning, all these different things, all these problems. There's not one dragon, well, poor dragons, but I don't want it to be the baddie, but it's not one problem, it's many problems, but it is connected. So by shifting the economic system, we have a chance of reducing poverty, reducing our ecological footprint, strengthen democracies, rebuild communities, revive rural areas, and so forth at the same time. So what that requires is a shift in the political mechanisms that have undermined our community, our nation states, and our environment. So the same things that Devinder also was talking about, like the trade treaties, the regulations, the subsidies, actually I call it corporate welfare packages, and the taxes. Why not redesign those in favor of regenerative economies and communities? And that means in support of place-based businesses operating within ecological limits. So basically we need to stop over-regulating and taxing the small and the local, and deregulating and subsidizing the big and the global. So part of that obviously is rejecting GDP as a measure of well-being and moving towards other more holistic measures like that of the Happy Planet Index or the gross national happiness of Bhutan. I just want to, before I talk about localization, mention some pretty important policy steps that can help us. Obviously, we have to remove the subsidies for fossil fuel exports and global transport infrastructure. That's pretty logic. We also need to end the carbon trading, which is just generating, is an excuse for more industrialization. And we need to re-regulate trade with the common good in mind. It doesn't mean localization, doesn't mean not having any trade, but having sensible trade, so people trade in the things that are surplus and don't grow, or produce primarily for export without covering local needs. So one group that have tried to come up with an alternative trade mandate is the Trade Justice Movement. For example, in the EU, 80 organizations from different countries came together to write up an alternative trade mandate. Reform of banking. My personal opinion is that banking have to be under government control, not private banks. Now we have nation states getting indebted to private banks, and when they screw up, they also have to bail them out with our money. And fair taxation, so we don't have this thing where the big can get away with not paying any taxes at all, while the others, people like us and small business, are overtaxed. So Tax Justice Network, they are working in that, and Positive Money are working on the reform of banking. I recommend that you take a look at their website. We also need to redesign where we live around the principles of localization with well-being in mind. So that takes a lot of thinking, because right now, many of the places where we live in the city, there are no green areas, there are nowhere we can grow food, there might not even be anywhere we can meet without having to spend a lot of money. So designing so that we can work where we live and the other way around is pretty important. Reconnecting to others and to nature is also something we see as fundamental as part of localization, and one of the greatest benefits, because without the connection to each other and to nature, it's very difficult for us to have true well-being. And it's also very difficult to be able to care for the land and for the soil if we're not in connection with it, because we don't see the consequences of our actions. We think that the local food movement, which is pretty strong in many places, is one of the most positive things that are happening, and it's a kind of vehicle for a broader localization movement. So it's about reconnecting people directly, or in shortening the distances between producers and consumers. And there are so many exciting things going on in the regenerative farming area, or the community-supported agriculture, where people are buying directly from farmers. They might even have a stake in the farm. More local outlets for local produce and human-scale production. And local produce on the menu is becoming, local has become really hip, to the extent that there are a lot of big retailers that now want to take that and brand it and have it there up at the front of the shop as the kind of a new kind of greenwash. So we have to look out for that. Farmers markets are springing up in many, many different places. We've had, there are lots of studies from all over the world that show that you have many more conversations in a farmer's market. It's really good for building up community. It's also really good for generating local wealth, because when you spend your money in a farmer's market or at a local retailer for local produce, they are going to go out and use that money and reinvest it in the same economy. If you go down to Walmart or whatever the equivalent, all that money will leave your community and will be spent elsewhere. So that's a leaking bucket that's not doing us any good. I want to mention a great farmers market in Costa Rica that was started by a friend. They didn't have any farmers markets there in the capital. A few young people set it up, and their vision was, let's make it as beautiful as possible. Let it be a joyous place where people can come, not only to buy their food, but to celebrate life. And within a couple of years, they had 3,000 consumers a week, two farmers markets, 500 families having their main income from that participatory certification scheme, so they didn't have to spend a lot of money on certifying organic. But the most encouraging thing is that the sons and daughters of those farmers for the first time said, we want to farm too. So it's not because they didn't want to farm, because there wasn't any opportunity for a real livelihood. Now there was the opportunity, not just the opportunity, but a secure market and a vibrant place to be part of. So I think we can do a lot through this to revive agriculture and to give it another status, which is very, very important. So consumer cooperatives is another model that has spread from Japan. In the Copenhagen Food Co-op, they have over 3,000 members. They buy organic food locally from a number of farmers, and that model has now spread to many other parts of Denmark. And that's a very good thing for people in cities. It's something you can organize around even if you don't have agriculture areas just around. Community-generated local food stores is also spreading. This one is from Exeter in the UK. They had no local food there, so 300 people got together and said, we'll start setting this up. They bought kind of shares and they got their money back later. And they sell local food. 70 of it comes from from regional, and 90% of it comes from a radius of 100 kilometers, I think. Small farmers is key to our food security. They're the ones that hold the majority of the seeds. They're, according to FAO, 70% of the food we eat worldwide is produced by small farmers. And they also have, they are more efficient. They are more productive per area than bigger farmers. So these local food systems are what allows small farmers to survive in this global economy. So that only reason it's very important to invest time in building up our local food systems. One of the ways in terms of policies that we can help move this along is through public procurement. So if all over the world, at every government level, we are spending money on buying food, stationery, and etc., etc. If that money, or at least part of the money, is shifted to buy local produce and organic produce, we can have a huge shift in a very short time. Now, this is from Milan, a city in Italy, that serve 80,000 meals every day in schools, kindergarten, old people's homes, etc., etc. And they decided that quality had to become before price in a 70-30 ratio. So in the nurseries, they have 100% organic food, and in the other institutions, 66, 25% currently is locally sourced, and 57% come from short distribution chains. So that has had an enormous impact, positive impact, in a very short time. There are lots of other examples I'd love to talk about. We don't have time, but I'll mention a few. Bristol in the UK have a very progressive local food policy, and it's worth looking at. Jeonju, our economies of happiness partners in South Korea, have at the root of the economics of happiness conferences started making really progressive local food policy plans. Maine in the US have now food sovereignty laws that allowed all the municipalities to protect their own local food. And Ontario has a local food act, Ontario in Canada, that is created to foster resilient local food system. That's just a few examples. So there are positive things happen on a policy level as well. And we need to get inspired and look at some of those things to see what we can copy, what makes sense in our own cultures. Some other things I wanted to mention in inspiring policy shifts. Vanuatu, South Pacific Island, one part of it had piling a ban on junk food, on imported junk food, because they found where they don't have any junk food, where they are isolated, they have good health. The other parts of the islands that have been exposed or have lots of tourists already have deteriorating health. So they are piloting a ban on imported junk food. Todd Township in Pennsylvania has banned corporate farming. They banned a certain size of livestock production, they have banned if you have absentee landlords or if the money leaks out of the community. And they've done that because livestock production, like average livestock production in the US, is really huge. Just to give an example, broiler chickens, I think it's over 600,000 animals. That's the average size. And the livestock, we are talking about thousands and thousands of animals. So that has been affecting the quality of the water, the soil, and all sorts of other things. So they have gone ahead to try to ban. Well, they have actually banned it. Let's see how it goes if they get sued by some corporation, which is possible through the free trade treaties and the investor-state dispute settlements. Of course, here in India, you have Sikkim. That might not be perfect, but it is the first state, the first region in the whole world that have gone organic. And then you have things like the bio-districts that started in Italy and that are spreading to many parts of the world, where farmers, municipalities, restaurants, and even the tourist industry are going together to say we're going to be supporting each other and buying ecological or biological produce and serving it in institutions, public institutions, and so forth. All right, local businesses alliance is something else that is helping to strengthen local economies, where a lot of different businesses get together to create a common front against the transnationals, including educating the local municipalities about the very important role of small businesses. They are the ones that pay the taxes, for example. No? So if you can't understand in other terms, you can understand in economic terms. Creating directories of local produce and services, of creating alliances so they buy and use each other's services. Or something like Totally Locally, which is something that has spread all around, well, many parts of the world, where they have like town kids that campaign for people to buy local produce. And that is also being very effective. And local finance and investment, the slow money for local food, where people like you and me with a bit of spare money lend it to local food initiatives, for example, with a very small fee. Equity trusts, which are similar. I'm running out of time. And the Re-Economy initiative I want to talk about from the Totnes, which is sort of the start of the transition town, where they every year have a pitch where local entrepreneurs can come and ask for money, talk about their sustainable project, and local people can pitch in and say, we will lend you money, or we will gift you something, or we will help you do the accounting, or whatever, or we help you do the marketing. And that has also been very positive and is something that could be easily copied. Creating community spaces like the repair cafes. There are now over 1,000 repair cafes all over the world, and they are spreading. People come, and instead of throwing things out, they repair it, and there are people that know how to sew, people that know how to do carpentry, people that know how to fix a bike, and they share the knowledge and help others. And it's turned out to be, at least in Europe, a great way of intergenerational activity. Local energy and decentralized renewable is also something that's very, very important if we want to have sustainable local economies. We can't be dependent on big corporate energy giants. And of course, eco-villages and co-housings are on the rise as well, both in cities and in the countryside. And since our friend Keibo Oiwa couldn't come here today, he is the founder of the Sloth Movement in Japan, the slow living movement, which is something that has been spreading there, where people think they're living in this hyper-industrialized society. So there are people that are moving the other way, wanting to work less, wanting to move to the city, to the countryside from the city, and want to dedicate more time to human relations and things that have with well-being in mind. And of course, part of this, I just want to mention the importance of local independent media in talking about the alternatives, because we will not get it out in the corporate media. So this is very, very important. And of course the education for healthy futures, which is what we are talking about here today. But I think that includes the fact that the economy is not talked about. We don't learn about it in our 10, 15, 20 years of schooling. So we have to educate ourselves and others, and that has to, what we consider to be one of the most important things, that connect with others to educate, renew and resist and celebrate life. So I won't go on, because if you want to hear more, we will have an Economics of Happiness workshop afterwards. I think I'll just speed along here and show you some of the organizations that are working towards systemic change, both on an international and on a national level. So these are worth looking up. So there are lots of things going on, which is hugely inspiring, both on a resistant and a renewable level. Thank you.